So the split module is all about allowing you to introduce split toning into your image, essentially the ability to bias your neutrals in your image. This is a key part of any kind of filmic look, and it's a key part of creating color separation, of creating depth, of creating color contrast. And it's one of these things that is often done kind of okay when I look at look development tools or even at just LUTs that are available for use out there in the wild. Most of us have recognized, wow, there's a lot of value in creating this kind of like split tone scheme, biasing our neutrals. And most tools and LUTs do an okay job of allowing you to introduce this type of color harmony into your image. The split tool is here to help you do an amazing job of creating the exact type of split tone that you want to see in your image. So there's lots to cover here. Let's dive in. So we've got our split strength. I'm going to turn on my show split curve first off so you can kind of see what's going on there. And you'll see we've got a curve like we've been looking at up until this point. We've also got our swatches down here in the lower right. This tells me the effective color that I'm about to start pushing respectively into my shadows and up here into my highlights. So as I start to pump strength in like so, you're going to see these curves diverge. And now I'm pumping this into the low end and this into the high end. Let's go to maybe a tighter frame and find a level for that feels decent. And we can now talk about the sliders that follow down below. We've got our shadow hue. This is in degrees around the hue wheel. So 172 is roughly in kind of a cyanish space. You can even see the dots here on my vector scope that these swatches are causing to be plotted that helps you orient. Okay, where am I pushing things in the bottom and in the top? Something that's always bothered me about split tone adjustments and making split tone curves is having to sort of freehand calculate like, oh, I want a bluish cyan or a greenish cyan and I want to push it into the low end. So I have to kind of manually figure out what combination of red, green, and blue is going to produce that particular hue angle. In this case, you don't have to do that math. The hue angle is there for you. You just pick the direction on the hue wheel that you want your low end or your high end to march toward. Highlight hue, same thing, just allows you to designate what hue angle do you want your high push to be moving toward. I'll move that to its default for now. Low versus high strength, this is the first instance of something that we're going to see several more times throughout this tool. The idea of a versus slider, the idea of defining a relationship between two related things. So low versus high strength is here to help us determine with whatever strength I'm asking for up here, how much of that strength shall I designate for the low end? If I go all the way to the low, to the left, I'm going to have all of that strength pushing into the low end of the image. If I go all the way to the right, all of that strength will go into the high end of the image. So this is a way of defining a relationship. Do I want equal parts going top and bottom? Do I want to favor the left? Do I want to focus solely on the left? Do I want to favor the right or focus solely on the right? Like so, okay? Your pivot point, this is going to anchor around the mid-gray of whatever working space you've chosen up at the top of the plugin, and it's going to determine where this crossover here happens, where you're crossing over, in this case from this kind of cyanish color to this orangey red color up top. Right now, it's crossing over at mid-gray, which is what 0 means. This slider works in stops, so if I want to cross over at a lower point, then I can move this down, or if I want to cross over at a higher point, I can move that up. Something I really like this pivot slider for is if I'm grading a really moody project with lots of night work or lots of kind of moody exposure, underexposed stuff, you can end up with images that feel like they're taking on almost exclusively the low end of the push and they're really not getting a chance to climb high enough in exposure to receive that upper segment of the split. And the whole point of a split is you want to hit your image with both sides of it. That's what creates that depth. That's what creates that color separation. So if you're grading something with moodier exposures, it can often feel really, really good to bring this pivot down a little bit and get that crossover happening a little bit sooner so that your moody exposure, which may not be consistently climbing up to mid-gray and well beyond, is still going to benefit from both sides of that split. Next, we've got our subtractive low and our subtractive high. This is really a way of defining how do you want to produce this color in your curve. With my subtractive low, if I turn this all the way to the left, I'm going to produce my hue angle of 172 by adding to base. Nothing is ever going to dip below the baseline that I had when I started drawing my curve. If I go all the way to the right, I'm going to get it subtractively, meaning I'm going to form this color by taking stuff away. This is a really nice sort of finesse that you can add to what you're doing up in your contrast curve, and it can help you to define how you are maintaining or how you're slightly deepening or how you're slightly opening your colors when you add your split tone scheme to your contrast curve. And here's the other thing I want to point out. Let's go to another image here, maybe something a little bit heavier, something like this. I just want to point out, color itself has different luminance. It feels different to our eyes. So you may find if you're doing a shadow hue that is more pointing straight at blue, like so. See that? I'm kind of pointing right at the blue vector here on my vector scope. And then I rotate that and I go toward more of a green, like so. Can you see how that image, let's turn this curve off, make it a little bit easier for us. This image is actually opening up in the low end because green carries more luminance than blue does. That's the other benefit of having these subtractive sliders available to us, is it allows us to kind of compensate for what's happening with the color that we've chosen. And if we've chosen a much heavier color, like blue, for example, then we can compensate by opening up our subtractive low a little bit, like so. Or if we've chosen a much brighter color, something like a greenish cyan or even just a pure green, then we might want to do the opposite thing. If I rotate this over here, I may then want to take my subtractive low a little bit lower, like so. So it's a way of kind of creating an interaction or a collaboration or a handshake between the color that we've chosen for our push and what we're getting out of our push. Subtractive high is going to be similar. The thing that I like to do here, I almost always like to turn this up to a 1 for the looks that I build, just because it ensures that I'm going to get a nice, clean, kind of matte finish to the top end of my images. This very much depends on your taste and depends on what you're after. If you wanted to get a pingier highlight and really feel that warm push, you might want to go subtractive high all the way to the left. I often feel like I want to keep things round and a little bit more matte, a little bit more creamy at the top, and having control over how much of this curve, if any, climbs above the original unity line really helps me to achieve those little details that I feel like are what help my look go from being decent or workable to something that's really, really strong and really, really tailored to the project at hand. Okay, moving on here, we've got our neutral segment width. This is simply going to allow us to determine how long should we be crossing over, if you want to call it that, before we go from cool to warm, or whatever, before we go from shadow push to highlight push, right? So if I widen this out, that's going to leave more room before those things transition over. This one's really important to me because I griped at the beginning of this module about the idea that so many split schemes I see out there, so many tools that allow you to do split toning, so many split schemes that I see baked into LUTs are mediocre. They've got the right ideas, but the implementation is not particularly elegant. One of the specific things that I'm talking about there is when you get into a situation where right on someone's face, I'm going to kind of cook up a more extreme example for you here. You can get into a situation if you have effectively what Contour calls a very neutral segment and a very strong split. You can get into a situation where the transition right on the planes of someone's face, of a subject that is in your image, that transition from cool push to warm push happens really fast, too fast. It feels too aggressive. It feels too imposed on the image. That's really my number one beef with split schemes. They're beautiful, but if you can see the fingerprints, they're no good, right? That's something that I've always wanted to have more control over, and that's why I developed this idea of a neutral segment, so that you can say, all right, we're just going to ride neutral for just a minute before we make that transition into our next segment where we're pushing warmth. It's a really good insurance policy against feeling that sharp transition from low cool push or low whatever color push into high warm push or whatever color push you've chosen for the top end. It's a really good way to kind of go about that. I would say in this case, even pushing it quite far, it feels nice and fluid and continuous to me. It's really not producing that effect that bothers me in lesser quality split schemes. But that's the idea, is that if you have a crossover that is too tight and you're doing too much in the top and bottom, you're kind of leaving your fingerprints behind in a way that I don't prefer to do. All right. I'm just going to reset a couple parameters here and let's take a look at what else we've got. So maybe we can widen out that neutral segment just a hair. Let's also back off a little bit on that wild contrast curve that I started getting into here. And if we move our way down here, now we can look at our curve start and our curve end. These are going to allow us to define where does our divergence in the bottom begin in the case of our shadow push. So if I start to push this up like so, you can see I'm essentially delaying where that divergence from neutral begins. At its default, with a curve start of 0, as soon as the curve starts, those colors are peeling away from each other so that they've got maximum time to create that split before they come back together for this midpoint convergence, right? But I can hold that off. I can delay that by pushing up my curve start. Similar idea with my curve end. This is going to happen up here on the top end of the image. I can say, hey, I would like these color channels to fuse together back to neutral sooner than the very top of the curve. This can be really nice if you've got very bright, like specular things in your image that you feel like are taking on an uncanny amount of color because of your split scheme. It's a really nice thing to be able to just pull this in and say, hey, I don't want to affect that white cloud way up there in the sky or that very bright specular that really should be colorless. I'd prefer that my split scheme finish what it's doing by the time we get into values that are that high in exposure. So it's another degree of control that you have in your split scheme here in Contour. And those are also, again, great examples to me of things that can feel really broken when they're not done right in another split scheme. It's like, wow, why are the clouds like going orange on me? It just doesn't feel right. Even if everything that has a lower exposure in the image feels really nice, those kind of like tells that are left behind can be a really problematic thing and a thing that really sort of degrades the quality of an overall look. All right, so let's take a look now at our floor divergence and our peak divergence. We'll start with the floor. This is for my film lovers. This is for my film print lovers who have seen this kind of shape in their film print curves where there is no neutral. It just stays cool or whatever color in the bottom end right on through the floor. We don't get any convergence at all. Things just stay separated. My black point is just cooler than the black point of my system. Same thing at the top, peak divergence. My white point is just cooler, or in this case, warmer than the white point of my system. And it stays that way right off onto infinity. So it's a really great thing to have control over, to say, hey, I want these things to fully come together or partially come together. And I want you to notice what happens when I'm adjusting my peak divergence here. There's a snap that happens as soon as I click this off of 0. That's because I've got a curve end that is set below 1 right now, but curve end gets zeroed out and has no effect the moment my peak divergence goes up because the curve has no end. It is continuing diverging all the way off through to infinity. Okay, same thing with the low end. If I have a curve start value, it has no effect if I have my floor divergence anywhere above 0, because what I'm asking for here is effectively no start and no end, just a curve that stays washed in the low end with one color and washed in the high end with one color, right through the floor and right through the ceiling. All right. Lastly, this last slider, this sat mask slider, this is one of my favorite sliders in the split module. This allows me to do what I like to call secret split toning. So we've started doing a pretty good roundup of stuff that bugs me in split schemes. You want to know the number one thing that bugs me in split schemes? Neutrals that I know should be neutral that are not neutral. Drives me crazy. I know we've all seen this before. We're like, yeah, that looks good. It looks stylized. Like the color separation feels high. It feels very colorful. It feels very deep. But like that refrigerator shouldn't be orange, or like that, bed sheet shouldn't be taking on that color, or that person's not wearing a blue suit, they're wearing a black suit and it should be black, right? This sat mask is a way of controlling where your split tone is affecting the image. So if we look at it in its default setup here, let's go ahead and turn our curve off for a minute. And let's just turn our highlight mode on and start to bring this saturation mask in. So what I'm doing right now is I'm effectively saying you have to fall below a certain saturation threshold in order to receive the effects of this split scheme. If you fall below 0.229, you will receive the effect of the split scheme. If you fall above it, nothing is going to happen to you at all. That's the logic that's going on here. And that can be really powerful too if you want to just adjust your neutrals and just pump color into your neutrals and say, hey, if this has color or it has a certain amount of color, don't affect it with the split scheme at all. That can be really interesting. That can produce really interesting looks. But the thing that I was just talking about, secret split toning, this might be my favorite. And in that version of usage here, we're going to do the opposite. I'm going to invert my sat mask, and I'm effectively going to say, let's go to an image that has maybe a bit more neutral stuff in it here. I'm effectively going to say, I don't want to have any effect on my neutrals. Can you see how my subject's headband and like these white lights and like the near blacks in these washing machines are being left out of the bargain now? And because they're being left out of the bargain, I'm getting what I like to call secret split toning, because the thing that gives away split toning most consistently to me is when you are pushing color into known neutrals or things that we know what color they should be or we know what color they shouldn't be, and yet they have color and it feels weird. So this can be a great way to sneak in all the benefits of split toning without having to take on the fingerprints and to leave behind the fingerprints and things that are not desirable in a split scheme. So I like to set this, somewhere close to 0. And you'll notice if I turn this highlight mode off and I enable my split off and on, this is a great example. This is now a very subtle adjustment, but it's very, very transparent. It's very, very sneaky, right? I'm adding some nice shape to the darker side of my subject here, but I'm not affecting like her headband at all. It's a much sneakier adjustment than I had before. And what you'll find is if you're rocking a split strength of like a 0.5 and then you go in and you try to do some secret split toning like I'm talking about here, you'll often need to pump this up a little bit because the overall effect is going to be way diminished. But even after you pump it up, because you're flagging this off of your neutrals, it's going to be a much more transparent, much more difficult to spot adjustment that you're still going to get all the positives out of that you want to. Increased separation, increased depth, increased color harmony, all those things that we like in a split scheme without all those nasty fingerprints that can get left behind. Okay? So that's our split module. This is a big one.